Warning, extremely disturbing material is discussed. Warning, grooming and CSA are discussed. It wasn't enough for Tate's basher to frighten him. He wanted to destroy any possibility that Tate and Noah could ever be together. He wanted Tate to be afraid of choosing men or Noah again. He wanted to make the consequences of that choice so severe and traumatizing that Tate would never dare make it twice. But there was something the basher had never understood. Tate could be terrified. He could be traumatized. He could dissociate. He could spend years trying to bury what had happened. But he couldn't erase Noe. And that was what had driven the entire pattern from the beginning. Tate had chosen Noah. He had chosen him when he was 4 in kindergarten, and then 11 years later at 15, Tate chose Noah again over 700 years of Blue family tradition. He had chosen him again and again afterward. And the man who had once believed he belonged with Tate had spent years trying to punish him for that choice. The stalker. The basher. The fiancé. The childhood sweetheart. The supposed lovers. The future Mrs. Tate Blue. Jay. The mysterious caller. The only man Tate had ever slept with. They weren't separate people. They were all pieces of the same identity. And once Noah, Susie, and Talia understood that, the entire history of Tate's life suddenly looked different. Jay was the man who was responsible for his godson meeting Noah. He convinced Tate before moving to LA that his godson on his first day of preschool needed to find the dumbest, most naive, sweetest boy in school, befriend him and bring him home. When Talia had told Andrew months earlier that Tate had committed felonies to protect Noah, Andrew had initially assumed she meant a civil offense or a violent crime, not something Tate had deliberately done to protect Noah from physical danger. But that wasn't what Tate had meant. The felony was the sexual relationship itself between Jay and his godson that happened one more time when Tate Blue was 25. Tate and Jay had been involved in a relationship that began when Tate was 4 years old while the boy was still a minor and Jay was 14. Jay had entered Tate's life before Tate moved to Los Angeles and met Noah. Tate's sexual relationship with Jay continued 9 years while they had grown up around each other, but they had never been equals. Later, once Tate was 8, Jay became an adult, making the union illegal and taboo. Their relationship had been between an adult with power and influence over a teenager who was still growing up when the first bashing happened. It was a felony because their relationship was statutory rape and insidious pedophilic grooming. That was the part that made Andrew's stomach turn. It wasn't a forbidden romance between two people of equal age. It was grooming, it was predatory and egregious. An adult had cultivated a relationship with a minor and allowed that relationship to become normalized over time. Jay had been in older and the relationship had continued for almost a decade. By the time Noah was 15, Tate had realized that he was in love with Tate. But Noah had never stood much of a chance. Tate was already deeply entangled in a relationship with Jay, a relationship that had begun when Tate was far too young to understand what an adult was taking from him. And there was another reason Noah's chances seemed non-existent. By then, Tate associated relationships between men with Jay. With stalking, grooming, sexual violence, brutal attacks, and years of fear. Any romantic relationship involving another man triggered memories of the person who had abused Tate's trust when he was young. Noah was not Jay in any way. Jay and Tate's relationship was shared childhood trauma that later turned into a trauma bond that became deadly and murderous, and why Tate had repressed his homoerotic attraction to Noah and instead dated girls so not to be triggered by unpleasant memories. This is why Jay's caller ID was called, definitely not Noah, because Noah's relationship with Tate wasn't a felony, and it wasn't a sick deviation of normal sexual relations. Trauma didn't always make that distinction easy. Tate could know intellectually that Noah was completely different from Jay and still have his mind associate male intimacy with everything he had suffered, pedophilic abuse that lasted 23 years. That was why the truth was so much darker than anyone had initially understood. Tate's basher hadn't simply been a jealous former lover. He had been an adult, his godfather who had entered into a relationship with a minor and manipulated that relationship into something that continued for years. He had groomed Tate. And that made him a predator. A pedophile who had hidden behind the appearance of a long-term relationship, allowing everyone around them to gradually accept something that should never have been accepted in the first place. Suddenly, Talia's warning to Andrew made sense. Tate hadn't committed crimes because he was protecting a lover. He had committed crimes while trying to protect Noah from the consequences of a history that Tate himself had never fully escaped. And the most horrifying realization was that the person everyone had eventually come to call Tate's basher had been at the center of that history from the beginning. The lies weren't random. The contradictions weren't random. The strange phone calls weren't random. The dissociation wasn't random. Even the bathroom on the third bathroom wasn't random. Everything led back to the same man. The same obsession. The same refusal to accept that Tate had chosen Noah. While Noah and Susie had watched from the car in the driveway, Andrew had gone into the garage to help Tate. He hadn't counted on Tate, thinking Andrew was his basher and stalker in a moment of psychosis. Tate had told Andrew the name of the person who had actually been stalking Tate his entire life, and the identity and truth of the situation were horrifying. It was so disgusting and vile that Andrew had vomited outside. Tate had shared 3 of his deepest secrets with Andrew, believing Andrew was his basher. For years, Tate had hidden everything. Noah hadn't had a clue. No one had. For years, the truth had been buried beneath so many lies, false identities, and missing pieces that nobody could see what was actually happening. But Noah remembered something now. Months before Noah had seen a phantom, a ghostly version of what 14-year-old Tate. At the time, Noah hadn't understood what he was looking at. The figure had appeared to him almost like a memory that had somehow stepped out of the past. And then the phantom had spoken. Everything is backwards. Noah hadn't understood. What does that mean, he had asked. But the phantom hadn't explained. It had simply disappeared, leaving Noah confused and unsettled. Only afterward did Noah begin to wonder whether the phantom had been trying to warn him. Noah had spent years believing he understood Tate's story. He hadn't. He had been looking at the consequences without knowing the cause, believing the people in Tate's life were separate when they weren't, and believing Tate's memories were arranged in the order they had happened when they weren't. The phantom had known. Tate had known. But Noah hadn't. And now Noah wondered whether the ghost hadn't been a ghost at all. Maybe it had been a piece of the truth Tate couldn't say out loud. Andrew remembered feeling furious on Tate's behalf after the psychologist found out his friend was bashed. Protective. Heartbroken. And underneath all of it, that same unbearable thread running through everything Tate did. Responsibility. Catastrophic responsibility. Tate brought Noah home at the age of 4 and believed whatever happened over the next 20 years was karma for Tate involving an outsider, an innocent variable that didn't know nor consent to what was happening, because it was imperative that Noah never have a clue what he had prevented, what his presence had provoked, and who couldn't be trusted. Tate believed something terrible would happen if he failed Noah. Or failed to stop something. Andrew leaned back against the garage wall, and rain tapped softly against the windows outside. For years he had thought Tate was hiding trauma. Now Andrew feared something far worse. That Tate was hiding himself from his own memories. And somewhere buried underneath the lies, the dissociation, the panic episodes, and the compulsive need to protect everyone around him was the real reason Tate had once looked Andrew directly in the eyes after crying on his shoulder, and invented a man who never existed. Andrew straightened slowly, still not meeting their eyes. "He's stabilizing," he said finally, voice quiet and strained, but that was a strong episode state. Noah frowned. "What does that mean exactly?" he pressed. Andrew exhaled, still looking away from both of them. "It means his perception was very far from the present," he said, "and bringing him back is taking more out of him than expected." Susie watched him closely. "You're shaking," she said softly. "I'm fine," Andrew replied immediately, but it came out automatic, not convincing. Noah ran a hand through his hair, packing a step. Susie looked back at the garage door, still half open. "And you," she asked carefully, "are you okay to go back in?" Andrew didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened briefly as he looked toward the garage again, then away. "Not immediately," he said. That was all he offered. Noah exhaled sharply. Susie and Noah were the ones who finally went into the garage. Andrew stayed outside. He hadn't meant to remain there. Every logical part of him knew he should have gone back in immediately, resumed control of the situation, continued assessment, continued grounding, and continued being the stable one. But his body had refused. He sat slumped against the exterior garage wall near the open side entrance, one hand pressed hard against his mouth as he forced himself to breathe through waves of nausea and disorientation that had nothing to do with physical illness. Rainwater dripped steadily from the edge of the roof nearby. Andrew stared at the pavement. "Get it together." Inside the garage, he could hear Susie's voice trembling softly. "Tate, hey, we're going to help you up, okay?" Noah's voice followed, lower and tighter. "Easy, don't rush him." Andrew shut his eyes. He could picture the exact position Tate had been in on the floor without needing to look again. Not because the image was gruesome. Because it was wrong. Not medically wrong. Not psychologically impossible. Wrong in the sense that Andrew, who had spent years believing he understood the architecture of Tate's mind better than almost anyone else, had walked into that garage and realized within minutes that his entire framework had been incomplete and so wrong that it was laughable now. Not partially incomplete. Fundamentally. Andrew inhaled slowly through his nose. For years, he had believed Tate's behavior could be mapped if enough variables were identified: attachment instability, identity disturbance, trauma-linked dissociation, compulsive caretaking, emotional fixation, hypervigilance, fear of abandonment, control through protection. Andrew had spent years organizing Tate into structures that made clinical sense. And inside that garage, none of it had been enough. Because the thing Andrew had never successfully identified, the hidden variable, the secret structural piece beneath all the others, had finally revealed itself in fragments. And it terrified him. Inside the garage, Noah and Susie carefully lifted Tate from the concrete floor. Tate barely resisted. That frightened Noah more than if he had fought them. Usually, Tate resisted vulnerability instinctively. Even emotionally, he redirected, deflected, controlled the room around him. But now he looked empty. Tate's limbs moved when guided but without conviction. His eyes opened halfway, unfocused and exhausted, briefly landing on Noah before drifting again. "There you go," Susie whispered shakily, "we've got you." Tate's voice barely formed, the garage sounds echoed loudly of each wall. "Cold." Noah immediately pulled off his overshirt and wrapped it around Tate's shoulders. "You're okay," Noah said quietly, though the words sounded more like something he needed to hear himself. "You're fine, come on." Andrew heard every word from outside. And every second made the realization worse. Because Tate's episodes weren't random. They weren't theatrical. They weren't manipulative. Andrew had known that already. But he had still assumed the episodes revolved around Tate's fear. Inside the garage, Andrew had finally understood something much more disturbing. The center of Tate's psychological structure was not fear of himself. It was a catastrophic responsibility for someone else. Tate had 3 hidden variables. Noah was one. It wasn't obsession. Not possession. Responsibility. A pathological, identity-level conviction that if Tate failed to protect the people he loved, catastrophe would happen. Andrew rubbed his face hard with one hand. Jesus Christ. That explained everything. The overreactions. The controlling behavior. The panic around separation. The inability to tolerate perceived danger around Noah. The emotional collapse whenever Tate believed someone was replacing him or no longer needed him. Because if Tate's identity had unconsciously fused with the role of protector, then abandonment didn't merely feel like rejection. It felt like failure. And failure in Tate's mind was tied to disaster. Andrew stared blankly into the rain. How did I miss that? Not entirely miss it. He had seen pieces. Everyone had. But they had interpreted the behavior from the outside instead of understanding the internal equation driving it. Tate didn't cling because he simply wanted Noah. Tate clung because somewhere in his nervous system, Noah's safety and Tate's existence had become psychologically intertwined. And inside the garage, Andrew had seen the consequence of that fusion stripped completely bare. Not in words. In instinct. Tate felt responsible for Noah's safety and in many ways for Noah's entire life because he believed he had invited Noah into hell simply by allowing him to become part of his world. Being around Tate was dangerous, unsafe, and terrifying. When Tate was 4 years old, he was already frightened of things he didn't understand. He didn't know how to protect himself or make the fear stop, so he went to Jay, who was 14 at the time, and asked him for help. Jay was preparing to leave New York City to attend school in Europe. He wouldn't be there to keep an eye on Tate or protect him from whatever Tate was afraid of. So Jay told Tate to do the next best thing. He told the 4-year-old to go to his preschool class after the move to Los Angeles and find a young boy who could be his companion, someone who could stay near him, provide protection like Jay had for 2 years, so Tate wouldn't have to be alone when he was afraid. Tate didn't understand what Jay was asking him to do or the implications of placing another child in that role. He only understood that Jay was leaving, that Tate was scared, and he had been given a way to feel less alone. That was how Noah entered Tate's life. Years later, Tate would look back on that childhood decision with an overwhelming sense of guilt. He believed he had brought Noah into a world that was never safe for either of them. Tate had spent his life trying to survive his own fear. Now he believed Noah had been pulled into it simply because Tate had needed someone beside him. And that was why Tate felt responsible for Noah's safety. In Tate's mind, Noah hadn't merely grown up alongside him. Tate believed he had invited Noah into hell. The 2 hate crimes happened because Tate had followed Jay's advice. Jay hadn't anticipated was what would happen over the next 11 years. Tate and Noah became inseparable. The more time Tate spent with Noah, the closer they became. Noah made Tate feel safe. He made him laugh. Most importantly, Noah gave Tate something Jay had never been able to give him from Europe, someone who was there. The one thing Jay never saw coming was that he wouldn't be the only one who could protect Tate from unseen forces. Noah became someone Tate was deeply grateful for in much the same way he had once been grateful for Jay. In time, Noah became a symbol of Tate and Jay's relationship, a gift, almost like a child created from the love 2 people shared. When 2 people love each other so deeply, a child can become a living symbol of that shared love, carrying pieces of both of them forward. To Tate, Noah became something like that. Noah was a reminder of everything Tate and Jay had shared, and of the love that had connected them even when the world around them seemed determined to pull them apart. Together, Jay, Tate, and Noah became the 3 musketeers. They were bound together by loyalty, affection, and a strange sense of family that none of them could quite explain. But Noah had no idea who Jay really was. Or at least, he didn't know the version of Jay that Tate knew. Tate wasn't capable of love, not in the way most people understood it. His past and everything that had happened before he met Noah had left him emotionally guarded and incapable of allowing himself to truly love anyone. Noah became a living symbol of that contradiction. Somehow this sweet, timid, tiny, compact, scrawny, gangly little blonde-haired goblin had slipped underneath every wall Tate had built around his heart and made himself at home there. Noah was just so cute, so sweet, so completely Noah. And somehow, without Tate even realizing it, Noah brought out something in him that had been buried for years, his instinct to protect. For 4 years, Noah had been the one protecting Tate. From the time they were 4 until they were 8, Noah had somehow managed to stand between Tate and the things that frightened him, even though Noah himself was small and timid. Then something changed. When they were 8 years old, Tate began protecting Noah. It was almost as though Tate had transferred everything Jay had once done for him onto Noah. Jay had protected Tate from bullies, from fear, and from the cruelty of other children. Now Tate found himself doing the same thing for Noah. He stood between Noah and the bullies. He defended him. He made sure nobody hurt him. And without either boy understanding it, Tate was repeating the very love he had once received from Jay, only now he was giving it to Noah. Over the years, Tate gradually pulled away from Jay. And Jay noticed. The jealousy became increasingly intense as Jay realized that the little blonde boy Tate had brought home by Jay's suggestion had become the person Tate trusted most. Noah was taking Jay's place in Tate's life. But Jay was trapped in an unusual position. On one hand, he was furious that Tate had grown so attached to Noah. On the other, he couldn't deny what Noah had done for Tate. Noah had protected Tate. Noah had made Tate happy. Noah had made Tate feel safe enough to sleep. Jay owed Noah a debt of gratitude for that, because the blonde was protective of Jay's lover. And despite his jealousy, Jay knew there was one line he could never cross. He couldn't hurt Noah. Tate would never forgive him if he did. That knowledge became the strange boundary holding everything together. Jay could resent Noah, envy him, and hate what Noah represented, but hurting Noah would mean losing Tate forever. So the jealousy remained beneath the surface, growing darker as the years passed. Tate hadn't been reliving a fantasy. He had been reliving an obligation. The certainty that someone would get hurt if he stopped protecting them. Andrew felt another wave of nausea twist through him. Not disgust at Tate. Never that. Disgust at himself. As Noah grew older, he eventually began asking Tate questions about their unusual bond. Why was Tate so attached to him? Why did Tate seem to need him more than anyone else? Why did Tate love Noah with an intensity that sometimes seemed impossible to explain? There were times when Noah asked Tate those questions while they were lying together in Tate's parents' house, and Tate never knew how to answer. Because the truth was complicated. It was one thing to love the person who had protected you when you were frightened. It was another thing entirely to admit that the person you loved had been brought into your life because of someone else. Tate couldn't tell Noah that. He couldn't tell Noah who Jay really was. He couldn't explain why Jay had been part of his childhood or why Noah had entered his life in the first place. If the truth about Jay ever came out, Tate's ex-lover could go to prison. But revealing Jay would also expose something much larger, something Tate had spent his entire life trying to bury. Jay wasn't the whole problem. Jay was the symptom of a much bigger problem. And Tate wasn't ready to tell Noah what that problem was. So whenever Noah asked why Tate loved him so much, Tate gave him pieces of the truth instead of the whole thing. He loved Noah because his buddy made him feel safe. He loved Noah because Noah had stayed. He loved Noah because, somehow, the frightened little boy who had once needed a companion had grown into the person Noah trusted more than anyone in the world. But Tate could never tell Noah that their entire history had begun with a secret he wasn't supposed to know. And that secret had Jay's fingerprints all over it. Tate's feelings for Noah throughout their childhood had always been deeply platonic. At least that was how Tate understood them at the time. Noah represented safety. He was the person who stayed beside Tate when the boy was frightened. He was the person who made him laugh, kept him company, and made the world feel less threatening. In Tate's mind, Noah's presence had originally been a gift. A symbol of how much Jay had cared about keeping Tate safe. That was the part Tate could never explain to Noah. In a strange and complicated way, Tate had loved Noah because Noah reminded him of Jay. Not because Noah was Jay, but because Noah carried some of the qualities Tate had associated with safety and protection when he was young. Noah was the person who had stayed. Noah was the person who protected him. And without Jay, Noah would never have entered Tate's life at all. That knowledge left Tate with an enormous sense of gratitude. He felt as though he owed Jay for bringing Noah into his life, even though the circumstances surrounding that decision had become increasingly disturbing as Tate grew older and he understood what Jay had actually done. It was one of the reasons Tate never told Noah the truth. And it was one of the reasons Tate never told anyone about Jay. Tate couldn't separate the good Noah had brought into his life from the terrible secret that had placed Noah there in the first place. To tell Noah the truth would mean forcing him to confront all of it. So Tate kept silent. He protected the secret. He protected Noah from it. And perhaps more than anything, he protected the memory of the little boy Noah had once been, the boy who had unknowingly become the safest person in Tate's world. Tate felt guilty for lying to Noah. Not only because he had hidden the truth, but because Noah had no idea that, in Tate's mind, the real love story had always been connected to Jay, not Tate and Noah. Whenever Noah wasn't looking, Tate would sometimes disappear to meet Jay, keeping their connection hidden from everyone. That was the secret Tate carried for years. Jay and Tate would sometimes drive to isolated locations, park the car, and disappear from the rest of the world for a while. Those secret moments became deeply imprinted on Tate, even though he didn't fully understand their significance at the time. Years later, Tate found himself unconsciously recreating that same pattern. With his adult hookups and with Chloe, he would choose hotels, secluded places, or simply remain in the privacy of his car. The secrecy and isolation felt strangely familiar, as though he were trying to return to something he had experienced long before. It also helped explain Tate's complicated relationships with teachers and other authority figures. He wasn't simply seeking the people themselves. He was repeatedly recreating a familiar dynamic: secrecy, authority, emotional dependence, and the feeling of being chosen by someone who held power over him. In many ways, Tate wasn't chasing new experiences at all. He was trying to recreate the ones that had been burned into his memory with Jay. The reason Tate could never fully return Noah's feelings wasn't because Noah wasn't important to him. Noah meant more to Tate than almost anyone else in the world. The problem was that Tate's heart had never completely let go of Jay. Even years later, some part of Tate remained emotionally attached to the person who had occupied such a complicated place in his childhood and adolescence. Tate hated admitting that. He hated that Noah had spent years believing their relationship meant something different to Tate than it actually did. And he hated himself for allowing Noah to love him without knowing the whole truth. That unresolved attachment was the ghost Tate had been talking about when he spoke to Chloe during the annulment announcement. It was the ghost that followed him into his marriage. The ghost that made him realize he couldn't honestly promise Chloe a future while another person still occupied a part of his heart. When Tate filed the annulment papers, he hadn't simply been running away from Chloe. He had been admitting that he was still haunted by the past. And the past had a name: Jay. Tate's friends had often wondered whether he had ever truly been in love. No one had ever seen much evidence of it. Tate hooked up with girls. No relationship ever seemed to mean anything to him. He could be charming and affectionate when he wanted to be, but none of it seemed to reach the deepest part of him. The truth was that Tate believed he had fallen in love only once. He had been a small child when he became attached to Jay, the person he believed had protected him throughout his childhood, a frightened, vulnerable rich boy who constantly felt as though the world was waiting to hurt him. To Tate, Jay had been his protector, his safety, the person who made him believe that nothing could happen to him as long as Jay was there. But as Tate grew older, he began to understand something he hadn't been capable of seeing as a child. Jay's protection had never been entirely selfless. Jay hadn't simply wanted Tate to be safe. He wanted control over Tate's life. He wanted to be the person Tate depended on. He wanted to determine who could get close to him and who couldn't. What Tate had understood as love and protection had also been possessiveness and control. And eventually Tate realized the most disturbing part. Jay hadn't merely wanted to protect Tate from other people. He had wanted to control Tate's intimate life and prevent anyone else from having the access to Tate that Jay had claimed for himself. That realization shattered Tate's childhood understanding of Jay. The person Tate had loved as his protector had also been the person restricting his freedom. Tate had spent years believing those two things could exist separately. They couldn't. The protection had been part of the control. And once Tate finally understood that, he could no longer look back at his childhood and see Jay as simply the person who had saved him. Jay's borderline personality disorder had never been diagnosed. No one had given Tate an explanation for what was happening to Jay, and Tate certainly hadn't understood it as a child. He only knew that Jay could become intensely afraid of abandonment, consumed by jealousy, and emotionally unpredictable whenever he thought Tate might leave him. Tate didn't have the language to understand any of it. He only knew that Jay could love him intensely one moment and become terrified, possessive, and controlling the next. Because Jay's BPD was undiagnosed, nobody around Tate recognized what they were witnessing or understood how deeply the relationship was affecting him. But the diagnosis itself wasn't what made Jay dangerous. Jay's abuse, stalking, coercion, and threats of sexual violence directed at Noah to control his godson's actions were his choices. What Tate absorbed from the relationship was something different: the emotional patterns. He learned to fear abandonment. He learned to become possessive. Tate clung to jealousy as a symbol of his affection for Noah. He learned to push people away while desperately wanting them to stay. He learned behaviors that later surfaced in his relationship with Noah. For years, Tate thought those traits had simply been part of who he was. He didn't realize how much of what he feared about himself had been learned from the person who had first taught him what love was supposed to mean. Tate eventually came to believe that he had developed borderline personality disorder as a coping mechanism, a desperate psychological adaptation to surviving JBPD and the chaos of their relationship. Jay's own mental illness had never been diagnosed or treated, and his behavior could become exceptionally dangerous when he felt abandoned or believed he was losing control of Tate. Tate learned to anticipate Jay's moods. He learned to monitor every reaction. He learned that refusing to prioritize Jay's feelings or his position in Tate's life could have terrifying consequences. Jay didn't simply want Tate's love. He wanted absolute control of Tate's sexuality, autonomy, and boundary-less access. That need for control eventually led to the murder-suicide plan. Tate refused to participate in Chernobyl. For perhaps the first time, he chose himself completely. He fled Jay's car rather than allow the stalker to determine whether either of them lived or died. Jay, however, continued with what he had planned. Tate survived, but the experience changed him permanently. He had spent years adapting himself to Jay's instability because he believed that was what he had to do to stay alive. The behaviors that had once helped him survive eventually followed him into adulthood, even after Jay was gone. Tate didn't understand that at first. He only knew that something inside him had changed. The very mechanisms he had developed to protect himself from Jay had become part of the person he was. Inside the house, Susie and Noah finally guided Tate into the living room. Talia rushed forward immediately from the hallway. "Oh my God." "He's okay," Noah said quickly, though his own voice was strained. "He's exhausted, but he's okay." Together they eased Tate down onto the couch. Tate sank into it heavily, head falling back against the cushions. His eyes remained half-open, distant. Talia knelt beside him instantly, brushing damp hair away from his forehead. "My baby," she whispered shakily, "what happened to you?" Tate looked at her slowly, like recognition took effort. "Sorry," he murmured. "No," Talia said immediately, voice cracking, "don't apologize." Susie stepped back slightly, emotionally wrung out. Then she noticed Andrew still outside through the open doorway. He hadn't moved. Noah noticed too. "I'll be back," Noah said quietly. He stepped outside into the drizzle and approached Andrew carefully. When Tate dissociated, it usually happened because of stress, emotional triggers, or questions that came too close to the truths and secrets he had spent years hiding. Whenever Tate felt cornered, whenever someone asked something that terrified him because the answer might expose the past, he could retreat into another state of mind. And sometimes he became Jay. That was the explanation for the strange voice. The creepy person who drank alcohol and spoke in inappropriate, unsettling language wasn't a random personality Tate had invented. It was Jay. Jay was the one who had warned Tate that Andrew wasn't who he claimed to be. Jay was the one who conducted background checks on the people who came into Tate's life. Not the people who came around Noah. The people who came around Tate. Jay had always been obsessed with control. He wanted to know everything about everyone who approached Tate, especially the men. Who were they? What did they want? Where had they come from? What did they know about Tate? What were they capable of? Jay wanted answers to all of it. When Tate was 14, Jay wanted something from Tate that the Blue Heir wasn't sure he was capable of giving: sexual and emotional exclusivity. Jay wanted Tate to belong to him physically and romantically. He didn't want Tate dating other people, falling in love with anyone else, sleeping with anyone, or developing relationships that might eventually become more important than theirs. Jay wanted certainty. He wanted to know that no matter who else came into Tate's life, there would always be a line that nobody else was allowed to cross. Tate resented the pressure, but was secretly flattered by Jay's ardent passions. To Tate, love was dangerous. Love meant vulnerability, dependence, and eventually losing control. His past had taught him that attachment could become a weapon, so the idea of promising Jay that he would never love anyone else didn't feel romantic to him. It felt like surrendering a part of himself. So Tate negotiated. He told Jay that if he agreed never to pursue another serious relationship, never to date for love, and never to become emotionally attached to anyone else, then Tate wanted complete freedom to keep everything outside their relationship meaningless. He could meet strangers, have detached sexual encounters, and walk away without allowing any of those people into his heart. Jay hated the idea. He wanted Tate completely. For a while, Jay sulked, argued, and pressured him. He wanted Tate to understand that casual relationships weren't harmless to him because, regardless of how meaningless Tate considered these lovers' competition, they still meant Tate was giving pieces of himself to other people. But eventually Jay conceded. There was one condition. If Tate was going to have meaningless hookups, then Noah was completely off-limits. Tate could never cross a physical, emotional, sexual, or romantic boundary with Noah. He could not use Noah as another casual relationship, could not blur the lines between friendship and intimacy, and could never allow himself to fall in love with the blonde boy. Tate agreed without hesitation. In fact, that particular promise seemed almost absurdly easy. Noah. Sweet, timid little Noah. Tate couldn't possibly fall in love with him. That was what Tate told himself. Noah was his buddy, his little shadow, the person Tate protected. The person who had somehow become woven into his life so completely that Tate barely noticed the threads anymore. Love was something Tate associated with Jay. Love was something complicated, frightening, and dangerous. Noah was different. Noah was safe. So Tate made the promise. He promised Jay he would never fall in love with Noah nor touch the blonde's body under his buddy's clothes. And for years, Tate genuinely believed he had kept it. What he failed to understand was that love doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it disguises itself as protectiveness. Sometimes it looks like jealousy. Sometimes it looks like anger when someone hurts the person you care about. Sometimes it looks like refusing to let someone walk away. And sometimes, by the time you finally recognize it, you've already broken the promise without ever realizing there was anything to break. What Noah didn't know, and what Tate made absolutely certain his buddy would never discover, was that Jay had found a way to keep watch over Tate even when they were apart. A few times a year, important business associates and influential people connected to the Blue family would visit for holidays or Christmas. Talia would sometimes invite several of them to stay overnight at the family home, turning the enormous house into a maze of occupied bedrooms, late-night conversations, and footsteps moving through distant hallways. Tate and Noah would usually sleep in the same room, talking quietly long after everyone else had gone to bed. Noah thought those nights were completely private. They weren't. Jay knew the house well enough to know how sound traveled through it. From another part of the house, he could sometimes hear voices through the walls and hallways. More importantly, he made sure Tate understood exactly what that meant. Jay didn't need to stand in the doorway. He didn't need to watch. The threat was enough. He had made it painfully clear to Tate that if he ever discovered Tate betraying their agreement, Noah would pay the price. That was the part Tate could never tell Noah. It wasn't merely a promise Tate had made to Jay anymore. It had become a threat hanging over him, and Noah unknowingly sat directly at the center of it. So whenever Noah climbed into bed beside him and began talking about something completely innocent, school, comics, some ridiculous story from earlier that day, Tate would listen and pretend everything was normal. He couldn't tell Noah what Jay had said. He couldn't tell him why certain conversations made him suddenly tense. And most of all, he couldn't let Noah put two and two together. Because Jay wasn't simply demanding Tate's loyalty. Jay was using Noah himself as the leverage to guarantee it. Whatever Tate and Noah said that wasn't whispered in complete silence, Tate knew Jay could hear every word or giggle. The ventilation system throughout the third floor was remarkably efficient, and sound carried strangely well through the house. Tate could whisper something to Noah from the bed, barely loud enough for Noah to hear, and knew Jay could hear it from somewhere down the hall. That knowledge stayed with Tate constantly. If Tate ever crossed the boundaries he had promised Jay he wouldn't cross with Noah, Jay might know, and Tate knew how jealous Jay could become. He had seen the intensity of Jay's anger and had heard the threats in his voice, even though Jay had never actually become physically violent toward him. Fortunately, after turning 13, Tate had begun to understand his own feelings better. Whatever romantic feelings he had developed for Noah, he deliberately kept them buried. More importantly, he didn't want to violate Noah's trust or betray the agreement he had made with Jay. For a while, that made everything simple. Tate could be Noah's best friend. He could protect him. He could sleep beside him, talk to him, laugh with him, and care about him without crossing the boundaries he had promised to respect. At least that's what Tate believed. Then his sleeping problems began. And suddenly, the boundaries he'd spent years carefully maintaining became much harder to control. Unfortunately, shortly before Tate's arrested development and his godson's 15th birthday, Tate developed a serious sleep disorder. His sleep became increasingly restless and unpredictable, and there were occasions when he crossed physical boundaries with Noah while he was asleep, without any conscious awareness of what he was doing. Tate had no memory of those moments. Noah didn't understand them either. But Jay heard enough through the ventilation system to become convinced that Tate was breaking the promise they had made to each other. Jay didn't know Tate was asleep when he humped Noah. He didn't know Tate wasn't consciously choosing any of it. Years later, Jay would finally understand that distinction and realize Tate hadn't intentionally betrayed him. But at the time, Jay had only what he could hear through the walls, and he interpreted it through the lens of his own jealousy and fear. From Jay's perspective, the situation was devastating. Imagine believing that the person who had promised you exclusivity, your former fiancé, the person who had sworn never to cross that particular boundary, was secretly becoming physically involved with the very person you had specifically told him to stay away from. To Jay, it wasn't an accident. It was betrayal. And that belief became one of the 3 major reasons that eventually pushed Jay to attack Tate in the shower. Jay didn't understand that Tate had been asleep. He only understood what he thought he had heard. And by the time he learned the truth, the damage had already been done. Tate had spent so many years living under that scrutiny that, when he became frightened, his mind sometimes returned to the person who had once controlled everything for him. That was why the truth had been so difficult to see. Everyone had assumed the problem was Noah. They thought Tate was frightened because Noah was in danger. They thought the dissociation was somehow connected to Tate's relationship with Noah. They thought Noah was the center of the mystery. But everything was backwards. It wasn't about Noah at all. It had always been about Tate and Jay. Noah's presence was simply the explanation Tate allowed everyone else to believe. As long as everyone thought Noah was the reason Tate was behaving strangely, nobody would look deeper. Nobody would ask why Tate was really afraid. Nobody would ask who he was becoming when he dissociated. And nobody would ask why Jay's voice seemed to be coming out of Tate's mouth. Tate's family, friends, and social environment had spent years blaming Noah's presence for the rumors surrounding Tate because it was easier than admitting the truth. The danger had never started with Noah. It had started with Tate's past. And Jay had never really left it. The stories about the stalkers from Tate's high school had been manufactured to make sure nobody ever looked in the right direction. The supposed female stalker hadn't existed. The stories about multiple stalkers hadn't been true either. They were distractions, false trails designed to keep everyone searching for strangers when the real danger had been someone Tate already knew. Tate's supposed stalker and fiancé was actually his godfather. He was a man who had access to virtually every part of Tate's life. He knew the family, he knew Tate's history, he knew the people around him. Jay had met Noah when the blonde was a child. More importantly, Tate trusted Jay completely. He was also Tate's power of attorney. That made the betrayal even more profound. Tate had trusted Jay with his life. For years, Jay had occupied a position of enormous authority in Tate's world. He was someone Tate believed would protect him, someone who could make decisions for him when Tate couldn't. But Jay's attachment to Tate eventually became possessive. Then Noah became important. Jay became increasingly jealous of the bond between Tate and Noah, and the jealousy gradually transformed the relationship into something darker. Jay couldn't tolerate the idea that someone else might become more important to Tate than he was. The man Tate had once trusted to protect him became the person Tate needed protection from. And that was the secret the false stalker stories had been designed to conceal. Everyone had been looking for an unknown predator. The predator had been someone Tate had trusted enough to give extraordinary access to his life. Andrew still sat against the garage wall, pale and silent. Andrew didn't want to sugarcoat it. He knew Jay was a smaller fish compared with the real problem. Tate and Jay had become close because Jay had protected Tate from something far more dangerous than jealousy or possessiveness, a powerful predator who seemed to have access to every part of Tate's life. This was a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. He had access to the Blue family home, appeared at holidays and family gatherings, and was trusted, particularly by Talia. To everyone else, he was simply another wealthy family friend. An influential man who belonged comfortably within the social world of the Blue dynasty. Andrew saw something much darker. He had begun to wonder whether this man had exploited Tate when Tate was a small child, and whether the possibility of trafficking or prolonged exploitation could explain some of the things Tate struggled with later in life. Andrew didn't have all the answers, but the possibility was horrifying enough that he couldn't dismiss it. Jay had seen the danger. He understood that Tate was vulnerable long before Tate understood it himself. Jay tried to put himself between Tate and the man whenever he could, using his own wealth, influence, and physical presence as a shield. Jay was a billionaire in his own right, but money wasn't what mattered most in those moments. He had the strength, confidence, and background to confront someone who seemed untouchable. To Tate, Jay had been his protector. To Andrew, however, the picture was more complicated. Jay had protected Tate from one predator while developing controlling and possessive behavior of his own. He could be jealous, threatening, and emotionally manipulative. But Andrew understood the distinction. Jay wasn't the beginning of Tate's trauma. He was someone who had stepped into the middle of it. And somewhere behind all of them stood the man Andrew increasingly believed might have been the true source of Tate's deepest wounds. The man Tate feared most of all wasn't his fiancée, but one of the wealthiest people in California, a billionaire and entrepreneur, a man who believed he could do anything. This man was a psychopath and a human trafficker. He enjoyed coercion and terrifying young children, using guns, rope, and sexual abuse to get whatever he wanted. This was the man Tate had become like when he placed a gun next to Noah's head in the bedroom after the shower incident. The only person this sadist feared was Jay, because Jay knew this man's secret. Jay had beaten the man up a few times, and the sadist largely left Tate alone after Noah came into the picture. Then something happened, and Jay wasn't around anymore to protect Tate. It was then that this horrible man began to control Tate again, especially when Tate was in his 20s. Tate did whatever this horrible man told him to do because the sadist had threatened the one thing Tate loved most in the world. Noah. If Tate didn't do what the man wanted, he threatened to kill Noah. That was the weakness Tate had always had. For all his money, power, anger, and emotional detachment, there was one person he couldn't risk losing. Noah. This was what made Andrew reconsider the dream Noah had described, the one where Noah was a young boy trapped in a hole. Perhaps it hadn't really been a dream at all. Perhaps Noah had heard or experienced something while he was unconscious or drugged and later remembered fragments of it. A repressed memory. Maybe Noah's mind had taken something real and buried it beneath the only form it could tolerate, a nightmare. And perhaps that was why Tate had done whatever the man demanded. The sadist had discovered Tate's only weakness. Tate could endure almost anything done to him. But he couldn't endure the thought of something happening to Noah. The awful man would wait until the important people weren't around, especially Talia. When the NYC house became quieter and there were fewer witnesses, the sadist would torment Tate. Sometimes Tate would hide underneath his bed. Other times, he would run down the hall and seek shelter in Jay's bedroom, staying close to Jay because Jay was one of the only people who made him feel safe. The man didn't allow anyone to show emotion except anger or silence. fear, sadness, crying, none of it was permitted. And when Tate was a child, the man had actually shot him a few times for daring to disobey him. That was why Tate learned so early to stay quiet, hide, and do whatever he was told. And it was also why Jay's presence meant so much to him. When the man came looking for Tate, Jay was the person Tate ran toward. Noah walked out of Talia's house to find Andrew, who was sitting next to the empty hot garage. "Andrew." No response at first. Then finally, "I was wrong." The words came out flat. Noah crouched slightly. "About what?" Andrew laughed once under his breath, not humor, just disbelief directed inward. "About all of it. I was wrong about everything." Noah's expression tightened. "What did you see in there?" Andrew stared ahead, tears forming in his eyes. "Tate." "That's not an answer." "I know." Andrew swallowed hard. Then finally looked at Noah directly. And Noah immediately understood why Susie had looked frightened earlier. Because Andrew looked shaken in a way Noah had never seen before. Not scared of Tate. Scared by what he had realized about him. Before her death, Serena discovered who Jay was because, in the end, the answer had been sitting in plain sight. She had been standing in the kitchen pouring herself a glass of juice when she noticed the postcards covering the refrigerator. The cards were from friends, family members, business associates, and other important people in Tate's life. They were ordinary reminders of birthdays, holidays, congratulations, and old connections. Then Serena saw one particular card. Tate's godfather's Christmas card. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Serena must have frozen. She must have stared at the card for several seconds, her mind racing as everything suddenly connected. The handwriting was the same. The name she had been trying to understand was suddenly attached to a person she already knew. Jay. Tate's godfather. Serena's reaction was immediate. She began to unravel. Serena had never met Tate's godfather, but she had seen pictures and watched home videos which recorded Jay and the man that held a gun who used coercion. It wasn't simply the discovery itself that terrified her, it was what the discovery meant. Tate's godfather no longer had access to the house, but that didn't make Serena feel safe. If anything, it made the situation more frightening. She didn't know who else in Tate's family knew. Had Tate's parents known? Had other relatives known? Had someone recognized the handwriting years ago and simply chosen not to say anything? And if the family had known the truth, how far would they have gone to protect it? Serena couldn't stop thinking about that question. She didn't know who she could trust. She didn't know who had been protecting Tate and who had been protecting Jay. And she certainly didn't know what people might be willing to do to keep the truth from coming out. That was what caused Serena's meltdown. She wasn't simply frightened of Jay. She was frightened that Jay might not have been the only person keeping secrets. Andrew understood why Serena had been terrified. She had discovered that her best friend's husband, Tate, had been involved as a minor with an adult in a relationship that had lasted for 9 years. Tate had been involved with a predator. A felon. A sexual deviant. Someone who had occupied a position of trust and respect by Tate's family while secretly maintaining a relationship that should never have existed. Andrew could barely comprehend it himself. Her best friend had married a man who had spent years involved with a pedophile. Not some stranger hiding somewhere outside the family. Someone everyone knew. Someone everyone trusted. Someone who had been held in the highest esteem by Tate's family. Someone who had been given extraordinary access to Tate's life. Someone who had been Tate's godfather. Andrew kept thinking about Serena's reaction. Had she immediately wondered whether Tate's family knew? Had she wondered whether they had known for years? And if they had known, what had they done about it? Andrew couldn't shake the question. What would a rich family do to protect a secret like that? He didn't want to believe Tate's family had known. He desperately wanted to believe that nobody had understood what was happening. But the timeline bothered him. A minor couldn't simply remain in a relationship with an adult for 9 years without someone noticing something. Someone should have seen the warning signs. Someone should have asked questions. Someone should have intervened. And if nobody had, Andrew wondered whether it was because nobody knew or because somebody had known and deliberately remained silent. That possibility made his stomach turn. Andrew looked at everything differently now. The false stories about stalkers. The strange explanations. The secrecy surrounding Tate. The way everyone seemed to know pieces of the story without ever knowing the whole thing. And now Jay. A trusted godfather. A person who had been close enough to Tate to hide in plain sight. Andrew finally understood why Serena had broken down. She hadn't simply discovered who Jay was. She had discovered the possibility that an entire family might have been standing around the truth without recognizing it, or worse, recognizing it and choosing to look away. Andrew realized that Tate obviously knew what Serena had found out. He suspected Tate had removed his godfather's postcard from the refrigerator while he was mopping the floor while Serena had fled the house. It was such a small thing, almost insignificant, but now Andrew couldn't stop thinking about it. Serena hadn't wanted Chloe to come home. At first, Andrew hadn't understood why. Now he did. Serena didn't know who in Tate's family knew the truth. She didn't know who had been protecting Tate, who had been protecting Jay, or who might have known what had happened all those years ago. And that uncertainty terrified her. Rich people could make problems disappear, Serena had always believed. Money could buy lawyers, silence, private investigators, settlements, and people willing to look the other way. But Andrew thought the part that frightened Serena most was Tate himself. She didn't know what Tate would do to keep his secret from becoming public. In her mind, Tate had already demonstrated that he was capable of doing almost anything to protect the secrets surrounding his life. Andrew didn't know whether Tate would actually hurt anyone. But Serena was terrified enough to believe he might. She feared that if Tate discovered exactly what she knew, he might try to silence her, or that Chloe could somehow become a target simply because she was connected to the truth. That was why Serena didn't want Chloe walking back into that house. She wasn't afraid of an ordinary family secret. She was afraid that she had accidentally uncovered something powerful people had spent years making sure nobody found. And now that she knew, she had no idea who was safe to trust. So she fled, and it ultimately killed her. Everyone Tate knew had villainized him for being hypersexual and for sleeping with so many women. They saw the behavior. They judged the behavior. But they didn't understand where it came from. They didn't know that Tate's compulsive sexual behavior had become a coping mechanism after surviving decades of molestation and years of sexual abuse by his godfather, beginning in childhood and continuing into part of his adulthood. Tate had learned to separate sex from vulnerability. He could sleep with someone without allowing himself to be truly known. That distinction became one of the foundations of his adult life. Tate couldn't be emotionally vulnerable because the person he had trusted most during childhood had been the same person who ultimately betrayed him and nearly killed him. Jay had known all of Tate's secrets. And Jay was one of Tate's worst secrets. That was why Tate found genuine intimacy so frightening. Sex was easy. Trust was not. Tate was so terrified of being emotionally vulnerable that it induced seizures and dissociation. Being physically close to someone didn't necessarily require Tate to reveal what was inside his head. Emotional intimacy did. Chloe represented something completely different. She was someone Tate was supposed to be emotionally transparent with. She was his wife. She had every reason to expect honesty, vulnerability, and trust. But Tate was terrified of allowing someone he had slept with to truly see him. Because, in Tate's mind, being completely transparent with someone meant giving them the power to hurt him. He had learned that lesson from Jay. The person Tate had trusted most had known everything about him. And that knowledge had nearly destroyed him. So Tate built walls. He could let people into his bed. He couldn't let them into his heart. And the people around him mistook that emotional armor for coldness, arrogance, or promiscuity, never realizing that beneath it was a terrified man who had spent most of his life believing that vulnerability was dangerous. Tate's clothing, persona, vocabulary, charisma, lifestyle, and even his interest in women were all things he had learned to admire in Jay. Jay had taught Tate how to construct a facade. How to walk into a room and become someone everyone noticed. How to speak with confidence. How to dress. How to charm people. How to make people believe they knew him while revealing almost nothing about the man underneath. For Tate, the facade became a survival mechanism. If people only saw the confident, charismatic, successful version of Tate, they wouldn't see the frightened person underneath. They wouldn't ask questions. They wouldn't discover what he was hiding. They wouldn't discover how terrified he was of being vulnerable. Tate had learned that lesson from Jay, who had been teaching him how to survive long before Tate understood what survival meant. And Jay had his own history of abuse. Jay had been sexually abused by his father, stepmother, male cousins, and 2 brothers since he was a child in the 1960s. That history helped explain some of the damage Jay carried, but it did not excuse what he eventually did to Tate. Trauma could explain where someone's wounds came from without absolving them of responsibility for the wounds they inflicted on someone else. Tate never understood that distinction when he was young. To him, Jay was simultaneously the person who had taught him how to survive and the person who had ultimately become his greatest source of danger. So Tate inherited the facade. The confidence. The charm. The carefully constructed persona. He took the parts of Jay he admired and built them into himself, hoping that if he became convincing enough, nobody would ever see the terrified little boy underneath. What Tate didn't realize was that the facade Jay had taught him to use for survival would eventually become another prison. It wasn't until Tate's 19th birthday that he finally understood the truth about Jay's facade. It hadn't been merely a survival mechanism. It had been a clever disguise. A carefully constructed magic trick that allowed Jay to control what everyone saw and, more importantly, what they never saw. The charisma. The confidence. The impeccable clothing. The effortless charm. The way Jay could walk into a room and immediately make people trust him. Tate suddenly understood that none of it was accidental. Jay had built that persona so convincingly that nobody thought to look beneath it. And beneath it was the person Tate had spent years trying to understand. A predator. Someone who could move through respectable circles, earn people's trust, and hide his behavior in plain sight. The realization horrified Tate. Jay hadn't simply been hiding his wounds. He had been using the facade to conceal what he was doing to vulnerable Tate for decades. That was when Tate understood why Jay had taught him to become so good at hiding himself. The lesson hadn't only been about survival. It had also been about deception. And for the first time, Tate wondered whether every piece of Jay's polished persona had been designed to make sure nobody ever thought to look closely enough to discover the truth. Andrew spoke quietly to Noah near the garage. I spent years thinking Tate's worst fear was being unloved. A pause. It isn't. Noah frowned. Then what is it? Andrew looked back toward the house. Toward the living room where Tate lay barely conscious on the couch. And when Andrew answered, his voice carried a kind of horrified clarity. Tate was afraid you'd stop looking in the mirror and wake up. Tate wasn't afraid of the dark. Everyone in Tate's life was blind, utterly blind, but you, Noah, were the blindest of everyone. Andrew had wondered for years what the missing variable had been. Tate's worst fear was arriving too late to prevent the inevitable. The hidden law. The unseen structural flaw that made Tate's entire psychological architecture behave differently from everyone else Andrew had ever treated. He remembered sitting in Dr. Michael's office years earlier, long after midnight, files spread across the desk between them while cold coffee sat untouched nearby. Andrew had been younger then, more certain in methodology, more confident that every human mind could eventually be reduced into understandable systems if enough evidence was gathered. Dr. Michaels had leaned back in her chair, and he had said something he'd never forgotten. There's a hole in the center of Tate's life that hides secrets. At the time, Andrew had understood the statement clinically. There wasn't a hole in the center of Tate's secrets and life. Tate was the literal hole, the asshole or the anus at the center of everything. Tate's butt was the cause for all the issues Tate now dealt with due to a man's jealousy and possessive tendencies. Andrew remembered Noah had relayed something Tate spoke years ago to his basher in front of the blonde when they lived together after Brown. "You're an asshole," the basher had accused. And Tate had responded with, "That's an ironic choice of words. An attachment deficit. Identity instability. A missing emotional foundation." Tate didn't present like someone who had simply suffered damage. He presented like someone built around absence. Andrew remembered arguing gently against the phrasing. "He has strong attachments," Andrew had said at the time, "maybe excessively strong." "That's not the same thing," Dr. Michaels had replied quietly. Andrew understood that now in ways that made him feel sick. For years, both of them had worked under the same foundational assumption. Tate's childhood had been ideal while the young, privileged heir lived the American dream. Or close enough to ideal that it could not logically explain the severity of his symptoms. Stable home. Wealth. Structure. Consistency. Social opportunity. Parental involvement. No obvious abuse. No chronic deprivation. No visible chaos. Everything in Tate's external history contradicted the level of dissociation, panic conditioning, hypervigilance, and emotional fragmentation he carried. That inconsistency had obsessed Andrew for years. Because CPTSD did not emerge from nowhere. Not real CPTSD. Not the kind etched into autonomic reflexes. Not the kind that hijacked perception and replaced present reality with survival logic. Complex trauma required sustained environmental instability, fear that became structural over time. And Tate carried that structure everywhere. Andrew had seen it from the beginning. The constant scanning of a room. The inability to relax fully. The compulsive monitoring of emotional temperature in every room. The desperate need to prevent conflict escalation before it happened. The catastrophic reactions to separation. The way Tate behaved like disaster was always moments away from occurring. That level of conditioning came from prolonged exposure to unpredictability. It came from environments where emotional safety could vanish without warning. Which was why Andrew and Dr. Michaels had spent years looking outside the family structure for answers. Teachers. Bullies. Authority figures. Predators. Humiliation. Institutional abuse. Somewhere they believed there had to be an external contaminant. Someone had to have done something severe enough to fracture Tate beneath the polished surface of his life. Andrew remembered constructing theories obsessively. A coach. A school incident. A manipulative mentor. An abusive relationship hidden from family awareness. Something. There had to be something. Because the alternative made no sense. Andrew closed his eyes briefly. God, we were looking in the wrong direction the entire time. Not wrong in evidence. Wrong in orientation. They had searched for a monster outside these walls because they could not comprehend the possibility that the trauma structure had developed without a single identifiable villain. That was the realization unraveling Andrew now. Tate's fear structure had not formed around physical danger alone. It had formed around emotional responsibility. Around the unbearable perception that safety depended on him constantly anticipating, managing, preventing, stabilizing. The abuse that created the Tate everyone knew in California had happened in the house the Blue family owned in NYC. Any abuse that continued had to have been done outside the LA mansion so Noah or his Brown friends would never know. Noah's presence at Tate's childhood home prevented anything besides familial arguments from escalating into violence. Andrew replayed years of interactions in his head with horrifying new clarity. The way Tate monitored people's moods before entering rooms. The way he inserted himself into conflicts. The way he panicked when Noah pulled away emotionally. The way he overreacted whenever someone seemed hurt, upset, unstable, or endangered. Why Tate never mourned anyone's deaths in the Blue family or those everyone thought Tate loved. At the time, Andrew had categorized those behaviors as control pathology. Now he saw something else underneath them. A child who had somehow learned that love was conditional upon vigilance. Not consciously. Not verbally. Structurally. Andrew's stomach tightened again. What happened to you? Andrew wondered not just as a clinician but saw Tate as a human being who needed extensive medical attention and care. What had happened inside Tate's developmental environment that taught him he was responsible for holding reality together emotionally for everyone around him? Because children were not born believing catastrophe prevention was their job. They learned it. Slowly. Repeatedly. Systematically. The truth was something Tate could never speak out loud. That was where the truth lived, in the silence. Tate couldn't say what had happened because he had been taught from childhood that speaking a single careless word could get him killed. He had been threatened into silence until silence became instinctive. He also learned not to show emotion. Tate had been raised in a world of toxic masculinity where anger, rage, and dominance were the only emotions he believed a man was allowed to display. Love wasn't safe, grief wasn't permitted, fear was weakness. Any emotion that made Tate vulnerable could expose what he had spent his entire life hiding. So he learned to bury everything. If someone saw him cry, they might ask why. If someone saw him grieving, they might wonder what had happened. If someone saw him afraid, they might realize there was something he wasn't saying. And Tate believed that if anyone ever saw the truth clearly enough, he or Noah would be killed. That was why almost no one ever saw Tate cry. It wasn't because Tate didn't grieve. He was terrified of grief. Grief meant losing control. It meant allowing something buried inside him to surface. It meant becoming vulnerable enough for someone to ask the question Tate had spent his entire life refusing to answer. So Tate learned to swallow his tears. He learned to turn pain into anger. He learned to turn fear into silence. He learned to turn grief into nothing at all. And eventually, everyone around him mistook that silence for strength. They never understood that it wasn't strength. It was survival. Andrew stood and paced once by the garage, rain still tapping against the shutters. His thoughts felt jagged now, unstable in ways he hated professionally. He wanted evidence. He wanted chronology. He wanted facts. Instead, he had patterns. And patterns were becoming impossible to ignore. Tate's nervous system did not react like someone traumatized by isolated cruelty. It reacted like someone raised inside chronic emotional instability hidden beneath outward normalcy. That was why nothing had made sense before. They had been measuring visible events instead of invisible conditions. Andrew thought back to Talia. Warm, loving, protective, but emotionally oblivious in subtle ways. Then Terrence. Controlled, paternal, charismatic, unreadable. Andrew's chest tightened. Not abusive in the conventional sense. That was the problem. Nothing about the family looked suspicious enough externally. Which meant whatever shaped Tate had likely existed in emotional undercurrents no one, including Tate himself, had fully identified. Andrew sat back down heavily. For years, he had searched for the secret variable that explained why Tate's entire personality structure behaved like a trauma ecosystem despite the appearance of a perfect life. Now he knew. The hidden variable was not a single event. It was an entire way of existing. Tate's childhood consisted of everyone exploiting, sexualizing, preying, silencing, and taking from Tate while adults enabled predators who surrounded Tate. A childhood where Tate had unconsciously become emotionally responsible for stability itself because there wasn't a reliable, safe adult around Tate who would help him or make the abuse stop. And once that role fused with his identity deeply enough, the whole Dr. Michaels described had formed naturally. Because Tate had never developed a self, separate from what everyone else needed him to prevent. Andrew walked weakly up the front steps of Talia's house and into the living room. Tate was lying on the couch unconscious. He was sleeping while Susie and Noah sat on chairs nearby. Talia was making some lemonade in the kitchen while Andrew sat down on the couch by the fireplace. For years, Noah had believed the worst thing about Tate was uncertainty. Not cruelty. Not abandonment. Not even possessiveness. Uncertainty. The refusal to define what they were to each other. Andrew remembered every argument Noah had ever had about it. Every exhausted conversation. Every moment Noah had sat across from him angry and humiliated, trying to rationalize behavior that emotionally destroyed him while simultaneously binding him tighter to Tate. "He won't call us anything." Andrew could still hear Noah's voice from years earlier. "He acts like I'm the most important person in his life until somebody asks what I am to him." At the time, Andrew had sympathized with Noah completely. Any normal person would have. Tate's behavior had appeared contradictory in ways that felt emotionally devastating. Possessive but evasive. Protective but distant. Intimate but undefined. Tate wanted Noah near him constantly, emotionally dependent on him in ways that bordered on frightening sometimes, yet whenever the relationship approached clear language, Tate recoiled. No labels. No public clarity. No direct explanation. And Noah had interpreted that the way almost anyone would. Fear. Shame. Cowardice. Emotional selfishness. Andrew had believed that too once. Now, he understood the situation differently enough to make him feel cold. Because Tate's refusal had never been about not caring enough. It had been about knowing too much. Andrew leaned back slowly in his chair, staring at the dark ceiling. Jesus Christ. If Tate publicly defined the relationship, then the relationship itself would become lethal and Noah would be a target for psychopathic sadism, borderline sexual jealousy, and homicidal rage by four powerful rich monsters and predators. People would ask questions. Questions led to timelines. Timelines led to inconsistencies. And inconsistencies led toward the center of whatever Tate had spent his entire life psychologically barricading away. Andrew's stomach tightened. Tate had not merely been hiding feelings. He had been containing information. Not necessarily consciously, not in a calculated criminal sense, but structurally, emotionally, instinctively. Because somewhere deep inside himself, Tate believed that if Noah fully understood the truth of their connection, Noah would either leave or be destroyed by it. If Tate had labeled their relationship, Noah would have lost all access to Tate. Noah's safety hinged on how emotionless Tate was or the hateful words he said to adults and popular kids in school about Noah. Andrew rubbed both hands over his face hard. That was the part nobody around them had ever understood. Not Noah. Not Talia. Not Susie. Not even Andrew himself until recently. People kept interpreting Tate and Noah's relationship as a dysfunctional romance, when in reality it behaved more like a sealed psychological ecosystem. Self-contained. Protective. Pressurized. Held together by rules nobody else fully understood because those rules had not been built around normal emotional development. Andrew replayed years of Noah's hurt in his mind. The nights Noah had cried himself to sleep because Tate refused to define them. The resentment. The confusion. The humiliation of feeling simultaneously central and hidden. Noah had believed Tate was withholding commitment. But what if commitment was never the thing Tate feared? What if exposure was? What if labeling their undefined relationship would unearth secrets and dangerous jealousy that could hurt Noah? What if Jay had noticed Tate's sentiment for Noah when Tate was 13, then confronted Tate about his affection during a car ride which Tate later repressed? This adult man who knew Tate's secrets later attacked Tate twice due to the truth. What if all those years, Tate's refusal to admit or label his and Noah's love or feelings was why he and the blonde were still alive? Years before, Tate had told in bed to Noah why he was emotionally distant. "I ran Noah so you could stay." For years, Noah had carried those words like an accusation. He thought Tate meant he had run emotionally, that he had avoided commitment, hidden behind wealth, silence, and excuses. Noah believed Tate was admitting that he had always been afraid to let himself be loved. But Noah had misunderstood. Tate wasn't talking about running away from Noah. He was talking about running toward danger. Running had always been Tate's way of putting distance between predators and the people he loved. He learned to make himself the target, to draw attention away from anyone who might become a victim because of him. He had spent years believing that if someone was going to get hurt, it had to be him. Tate had already suffered many rapes and molestations, so what was one more if it meant that sweet Noah would never know the cost of what being around Tate really required? The second hate crime had never been about Tate simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It had been about him stepping into the path of someone else's jealousy. Tate had known the danger was coming, and instead of letting Noah become the person someone blamed, hated, or attacked, Tate made a choice. He ran. Not because he was afraid. Because he was willing to be caught. When Jay had asked Tate to make a choice, either they went back to where they had come from or they go into the warehouse, Jay wasn't simply forcing Tate to make a decision. Going back meant Jay wanted to tell Noah what was really going on and who Jay was. Tate utterly refused to allow that possibility to occur. Under no circumstances was Noah going to know the truth. Not because Tate wanted to manipulate or control him, but because Tate knew exactly what would happen if Noah learned the truth. His blonde companion would be terrified and begin to suffer from PTSD. He wouldn't be able to close his eyes without having nightmares. Noah wouldn't sleep alone ever again. Noah would become a Tate if the blonde ever understood the truth. Because Jay was a man Noah had really known, no one had ever had a clue about who he was or what he was capable of. There had been no warning, no indication that there was something beneath the surface that could change everything Noah believed about the people around him. Tate knew the truth. And that was enough. He could carry it, he could live with the fear and the consequences of knowing what Jay was capable of, but Noah didn't need to carry that burden. Tate would rather walk into the warehouse and face whatever waited for him inside than turn around and allow Jay to tell Noah the truth. Because some truths didn't set people free. Some truths only gave them nightmares. When Tate later said to the blonde in bed, "Whatever comes next, I'll take it," Noah thought it was another example of Tate shutting him out. Another reminder that Tate refused to let anyone in. But Tate had been saying something else entirely. He was telling Noah that he had sacrificed pieces of himself, his safety, his peace, his body, and his ability to feel whole, so Noah would never have to carry the weight of someone else's hatred. Tate became Noah's physical shield, protecting him from sexual and physical violence, taking whatever was meant for Noah and luring it away with Tate's own body. Tate had taken the wounds meant for Noah. And the cruelest part was that Noah had spent years believing Tate was running away from him when Tate had actually been running to protect him while drawing predators away from Noah. Andrew stood and walked slowly toward Terrence's study window. Rain streaked softly down the glass. Outside, the world looked distant and blurred. Inside Andrew's mind, old memories were reorganizing themselves again. Tate never panicked more than when Noah pulled away emotionally. That was the pattern Andrew had missed. Whenever conversations moved too close to origins, definitions, timelines, or emotional clarity, Tate destabilized. Deflection. Dissociation. Control. Possessiveness. Panic. Not because Tate didn't know what Noah was to him. Because he knew exactly what Noah was to him. And the meaning attached to that knowledge was unbearable. Andrew's chest tightened painfully. What happened between you two? Not sexually. Not romantically. Structurally. What foundational event had fused these two lives together so deeply that Tate experienced explanation itself as threat? Because normal people did not build relationships this way. Normal relationships evolved. This one calcified. It locked into place years ago and never emotionally updated correctly afterward. That was why outsiders could never understand it. From the outside, Tate appeared irrational. Why not let Noah go if the relationship caused so much pain? Why cling so tightly while refusing clarity? Why maintain emotional dependency without resolution? The answer, Andrew now realized, was horrifyingly simple. Because to Tate, letting Noah go was psychologically equivalent to abandoning responsibility. And defining the relationship risked exposing the original source of that responsibility. Andrew sat back down heavily. His thoughts kept circling one unbearable conclusion after another. If Noah truly understood the origin point of their connection, whatever Tate believed happened, whatever guilt or terror or obligation existed underneath all this, then Noah would finally understand why Tate had never been able to separate love from protection. And perhaps worse, Noah would understand that Tate's attachment had never fully belonged to the present. It belonged to something unfinished in the past. Andrew remembered Noah once saying bitterly, "If he loves me so much, why does he make me feel like a secret?" At the time, Andrew had no answer. Now he did. Because secrets were safer than truths powerful enough to destroy entire identities. Andrew's breathing slowed as another realization settled over him. Tate did not experience himself as someone having a relationship with Noah. Tate experienced himself as someone responsible for Noah. Permanently. Fundamentally. Almost religiously. That was why the relationship had lasted so long despite becoming painful for both of them. It was not sustained by ordinary compatibility anymore. It was sustained by psychological necessity. And Tate's refusal to define it had not been emotional immaturity. It had been containment. Containment of whatever lived underneath the relationship's origin, something Tate's nervous system protected with the same desperation it used to protect Noah himself. Andrew closed his eyes. For years he had wondered why Tate behaved like losing Noah would not merely hurt him but annihilate him psychologically. Now he knew. Because somewhere inside Tate's mind, Noah was not simply loved. He was tied to the single most important and most terrifying truth Tate had spent his entire life trying to survive without revealing. Andrew sighed quietly and stepped away from the living room before anyone could stop him. Tate still lay stretched across the couch under a blanket Talia had wrapped around him, pale and exhausted, somewhere between sleep and dissociation, while Noah sat nearby in rigid silence. Andrew could not stay in that room another second. Not because of Tate. Because of what Andrew could suddenly see now every time he looked at him. He crossed into the dining room slowly and sat down at the long table, posture stiff, one hand hovering briefly near the wood before pulling back again. He didn't want to touch anything. Didn't want grounding. Didn't want comfort. The entire scenario made him feel physically ill in a way he could not explain to anyone else in the house without sounding insane. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Andrew stared straight ahead. How did I miss it? The thought had become unbearable. Not because Andrew expected omniscience from himself, but because this was his field. His life. His profession. His expertise. Andrew had built an entire career around identifying hidden trauma structures inside people long before they themselves understood them. And somehow, he had spent nearly 10 years staring directly at Tate and Noah without understanding what he was actually looking at. Andrew rubbed his mouth slowly with one hand. Jesus Christ. Noah was never the problem. That was the realization poisoning everything retroactively. Everyone had treated Noah like the central complication because Noah was the visible emotional axis around which Tate revolved. The jealousy. The possessiveness. The panic. The inability to separate. The volatility whenever Noah pulled away. Naturally, people assumed Noah himself was the source. But Noah wasn't the source. Tate's transference towards Noah was evidence. A symptom. A living, recycled manifestation of something much older, darker, taboo, and far more structurally embedded inside Tate. Andrew leaned back slightly in the chair, pulse heavy in his throat. The relationship itself wasn't natural. Not in the way anyone around them had always framed it. That didn't mean the affection was fake. It didn't mean Tate didn't genuinely love Noah. If anything, that was part of what made the situation so horrifying. The love was real. But the structure underneath it had never developed normally. The foundation was wrong. That was what nobody had seen. The intimacy Tate and Noah had with each other their entire lives wasn't a relationship between two small children or two adults, but was a recycled copy of an abusive relationship between a young adult man and a prepubescent child. Tate's role in the relationship was the knowledgeable information limiting position, which was held by Tate's stalker for years, while Noah's role in the relationship had been Tate's role, which Tate lived his entire life. The reason why the relationship between Tate and Noah, even as kids creeped out adults, was because their relationship was a textbook example of grooming between an adult and a child. The creepy part was the grooming relationship was between two small children who neither groomed each other. It was a transference that Tate acted out every day. It was the actual undercover pedophilic relationship with Jay that Tate hid from everyone he knew later caused Tate to relive this disgusting illegal relationship by creating a healthier version with Noah. Everyone had seen it, or perhaps worse, what some people had seen and deliberately refused to acknowledge. Andrew's eyes shifted slowly toward the darkened hallway leading back to the living room. Wayne. The thought landed heavily. Months earlier, Wayne had said something to Talia over the phone that had barely registered at the time. Andrew remembered it perfectly now. Do yourself a favor and look somewhere else besides Noah. At the time, Andrew interpreted it as frustration. Maybe even blame shifting. Now the sentence sounded entirely different. Because Wayne had not sounded confused when he said it. He had sounded tired. Resigned. Like someone who already knew the center of the maze and understood everyone else was still wandering through the outer walls. Andrew's stomach twisted again. Wayne knew something. Not necessarily everything. But enough to stop looking at Noah as the origin point. Enough to understand the relationship itself was only the visible surface expression of a deeper psychological structure. When Wayne had told Talia to look at something else or somewhere else, besides Noah, he wasn't telling her to stop looking at Noah because Noah was the problem. He was talking about the magic trick Tate performed every day. He was telling her not to look in the mirror. Noah was a distraction. Jay was standing several feet away, and Jay was the real problem. Noah had never been the threat. If anything, Noah was the one thing in the room that helped Tate stay grounded. When Tate looked at him, he could dissociate from what was happening around him. Noah made him feel protected, safe, calm. The irony was that while everyone's attention was being pulled toward Noah, the real danger was standing nearby. Jay. And he wasn't alone. There were other bad people standing nearby too, people Tate knew were capable of things Noah had never needed to imagine. Noah wasn't the danger Tate needed to watch. Noah was the reason Tate could keep himself together long enough to face it. Andrew sat perfectly still. Then another memory surfaced. Wayne was talking to Tate privately months ago. The way Tate had reacted afterward, agitated, destabilized, emotionally dysregulated for days. At the time, Andrew assumed they had argued about Noah. Now he suspected Wayne had touched something far more dangerous. Maybe not intentionally. Maybe Wayne himself only understood fragments. But enough fragments to frighten Tate. Andrew shut his eyes briefly. And he said nothing. Or perhaps he couldn't. That possibility disturbed Andrew even more. Because once someone understood the hidden variable, silence itself began to make sense. How exactly did one explain this situation out loud? How could anyone summarize it cleanly? Tate's entire personality structure appears organized around catastrophic protective responsibility linked specifically to Noah through some unresolved developmental trauma dynamic neither of them fully understands. It sounded insane. And yet every observable behavior suddenly aligned beneath that framework with terrifying precision. Andrew exhaled slowly through his nose. Now that he understood the hidden variable he had spent nearly 10 years searching for, everything reorganized itself almost instantly. Not perfectly. There were still enormous gaps. Still pieces missing. Still events Andrew did not understand. But the emotional logic finally made coherent sense. Why could Tate not let Noah go? Why Noah simultaneously resented and emotionally depended on Tate? Why does separation destabilize both of them? Why Tate treated ordinary emotional distance like mortal danger? Why did the relationship persist despite mutual suffering? Because neither of them had actually been participating in a normal adult attachment structure. They had been trapped inside a survival system. And Tate had been carrying the weight of it almost entirely alone. Andrew's breathing slowed. Then another realization hit him hard enough to make him sit forward slightly. Noah didn't know. Not really. Noah felt the effects constantly, yes. He suffered from them. Reacted to them. Built his life around them without understanding why. But Noah himself did not appear to consciously understand the actual structure holding Tate together. And that changed everything. Because if Noah truly understood, If Noah ever fully saw what Andrew now saw, then Noah's entire perception of the relationship would fracture permanently. Not necessarily because he would stop loving Tate, but because he would finally understand that the relationship had never begun under emotionally normal conditions to begin with. Andrew pressed his fingers hard against his temple. God. All those years, Noah thought Tate refused to define the relationship because Tate was ashamed. Cowardly. Confused. Emotionally manipulative. And all those years, Tate had likely been trying to prevent Noah from seeing the truth underneath it. Not the truth about sexuality. Not the truth about love. The truth about the origin. About why the attachment existed in the first place with such terrifying intensity. Andrew sat motionless at the table for a long time. Rain continued softly outside. The house creaked quietly around him, and for the first time since he walked out of the garage, Andrew allowed himself to acknowledge the single conclusion now sitting cold and undeniable at the center of his thoughts. Whatever happened years ago between Tate and Noah, whatever foundational event created this structure, Tate believed with absolute certainty that Noah could never safely know the full truth of it. Andrew sat frozen at the dining room table while the realization continued unfolding layer by layer inside his mind until it no longer even resembled a theory. It resembled horror. Not horror directed at Tate. Horror directed at himself. At all of them. Because for years, everyone had described Tate using the same words. Obsessive. Possessive. Controlling. Paranoid. Emotionally unstable. Jealous. Delusional. Andrew himself had used some of those frameworks clinically, even if more carefully than the others around Tate, and now Andrew felt sick remembering it. Because what if Tate had never actually been irrational or paranoid? What if the fundamental error everyone made was assuming Tate's reactions existed independently from reality, instead of being reactions to reality that nobody else could see? Andrew leaned forward slowly, elbows against his knees, hands clasped tightly enough to hurt. Tate isn't psychotic. The thought hit him hard. Not emotionally. Clinically. Tate did not behave like someone detached from reality in the traditional sense. His perceptions distorted under stress, yes. His nervous system collapsed into trauma responses. He dissociated. He hallucinated during episodes, but the core fear underneath those reactions, the actual foundation, was not invented from nothing. That was the part Andrew finally understood. Tate wasn't reacting to imaginary danger. He was reacting to real danger interpreted through a catastrophically overdeveloped protective system. Andrew's breathing slowed as memory after memory rearranged itself. Mark. Jack. Teachers. Older men. Friends of the family. Authority figures. Men Noah trusted instinctively because Noah himself was emotionally open in ways Tate never had been. And every single time, Tate reacted badly. Aggressively. Suspiciously. Possessively. At the time, everyone, including Noah, assumed Tate simply could not tolerate sharing emotional space. But what if Tate's reactions had never actually centered around jealousy at all? Andrew shut his eyes. Jesus Christ. Tate wasn't trying to isolate Noah from people because he wanted ownership. He was trying to protect Noah from something Tate believed existed everywhere. Predation. That was the hidden terror beneath all of it. Not homosexuality itself. Not romance. Predation disguised itself as kindness, generosity, fatherly concern, and innocent interest, quietly feeding upon Noah's naive trust in the goodness of others. Nowhere was that deception more complete than around Terrence's breakfast table, where polished silverware, warm smiles, effortless conversation, and the appearance of a loving family concealed what Tate believed was a far darker reality. Morning after morning, Noah sat among them, laughing over coffee and toast, accepting casual conversation as though he were surrounded by safety. Tate secretly knew what Noah was too oblivious to discover. Every rich man the blonde knew from childhood or stood near at parties who wasn't Noah's friend from Brown or Mark had previously attempted to rape Tate or had succeeded in doing so. Every man Noah encountered inside Tate's world was, in Tate's mind, a predator. Every male who ate at Terrence's table, every respected family friend welcomed into the blue home, every influential guest, and every man upon whose lap Noah had innocently sat as a child was a rapist who represented another face Tate associated with fear and betrayal. To Noah, they were simply familiar men who had always been part of the family. To Tate, they were predators hidden behind wealth, respectability, charm, and lifelong trust. While Noah saw a breakfast table surrounded by loved ones, Tate saw a room filled with men he believed had spent years disguising predation as kindness, leaving Noah completely unaware that the greatest danger in Tate's eyes had always been sitting beside him. Long before Noah understood why, Tate as a small child reacted with absolute panic whenever one of the male guests or business partners who walked through Tate's house reached for Noah. Tate reacted by screaming. If Terrence lifted Noah onto his lap, if a relative ruffled Noah's blonde hair, if an uncle casually wrapped an arm around his shoulders or drew him into a hug, Tate would erupt. He would shriek, cry, throw violent tantrums, lash out, or even bite anyone who tried to restrain him. To everyone else, it looked like irrational jealousy or the possessiveness of a difficult child. They assumed Tate couldn't bear sharing Noah's attention. Joey, however, saw something different. Without a word, he would quietly cross the room, lift Noah off the man's lap and carry him away before Tate's panic spiraled completely out of control. Joey recognized that Tate wasn't fighting for attention. He was trying to separate Noah from people Tate believed were dangerous. The same terror explained why Tate screamed whenever Terrence tried to pick him up, especially during his preschool years. The adults dismissed it as another childhood outburst, never realizing that Tate had already learned to fear being touched. To Tate, an affectionate gesture was never just an affectionate gesture. Every hand reaching toward Noah became another warning, another memory, another reminder of what he believed had happened to him. Noah remained blissfully unaware, seeing only family members treating him with ordinary affection, while Tate saw familiar faces that filled him with dread. His desperate attempts to keep Noah out of their arms were never, in Tate's mind, about jealousy. They were about protecting the one person he loved from a danger he believed no one else could see. When Tate was very young, he became profoundly touch-avoidant. To the adults around him, he seemed like a difficult child who acted out for no apparent reason. Whenever he misbehaved, which, in reality, was often his only attempt to reclaim a small measure of control over a life in which he felt powerless, someone in the family would inevitably try to pick him up. Tate would immediately kick, scream, thrash, and fight with everything he had, refusing to be held no matter how much they insisted they were only trying to calm him down. His reactions were dismissed as tantrums, stubbornness, or bad behavior, but beneath them was a child desperately trying to protect the only thing he still believed belonged to him, his own body. Everything changed the moment Joey stepped in. Joey would quietly lift Tate into his arms, lean close, and whisper softly into his ear who he was before saying another word. Almost instantly, the kicking stopped. The screaming faded. Tate's rigid body relaxed, and he no longer fought to get away. Joey was the one person Tate believed was safe, the only member of the family he trusted not to exploit his vulnerability, where everyone else saw an impossible child who hated being touched. Joey saw a frightened little boy whose trust had been shattered, and he understood that before Tate could accept comfort, he first needed to know exactly who was holding him. Tate's psychogenic non-epileptic seizures, PNES, were understood by his treatment team as occurring in the context of severe complex post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from prolonged childhood sexual abuse and violent coercion involving a gun. They were not random. They were most likely to occur when something triggered overwhelming fear or traumatic memories, seeing someone he associated with the abuse, hearing people talk about them, reliving the events in nightmares, or by experiencing a panic attack so intense that his mind and body could no longer cope. The seizures became his nervous system's involuntary response to unbearable psychological distress, expressing trauma that words could not. Those same experiences shaped Tate's inability to sleep alone. In his own mind, the house where he grew up had never felt safe. Nighttime left him feeling defenseless, and sleep meant surrendering the vigilance that had helped him survive. The only person in his family whom Tate believed had never harmed or exploited him was his uncle Joey. Joey represented safety in a place where Tate felt none existed, and that single trusted relationship became an anchor amid years of fear. Even as an adult, the memories of those moments stay with Tate.